an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Skysworn Chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. In these chapters, we get a confrontation. Seems like too strong a word, but there's a moment of truth between Lindon and Yerin in which Lindon has to show up for her. And it takes a little bit of prodding, but he gets there. I don't love the way that chapter 13 ends, though, because the last sentence is, Lindon went to his death. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Andy for commissioning this episode and for rolling with me. I had to postpone this episode, so I'm recording on a Saturday. I really don't know whether that last sentence was meant to be literal or not, but either way, I'm very nervous about it. This series of chapters is very interesting. Every book we've gotten introduced to a new portion of this world, a new sect of people, a new territory, way of life. And this time, rather than being brought to a piece of land, we are taken onto the Skysworn's basically floating city, which they call Storm Rock. And I had an idea of how big it was in my mind, and then I sort of discounted that and thought that was just too much until we get to a spot a little bit later in which Renfei says that it's home to about 2 million people. To which I just said, word? That's so much more than I would have thought. That is so much. I just can't even and she says too, very specifically, how it costs a fortune in wind scales to keep it aloft every second. If the Empire didn't have so many underlords on wind and cloud paths, we would never be able to fly it at all. And there's 2 million people on it, but 5,000 of them are Skysworn or trainees, and the rest are families and all of the people that you need in order to keep a city self-sustaining. People growing food, people making items, and, blacksmiths and things like that. So this is a really fascinating idea. I am extremely into the whole concept of something like this, a city that's mobile and also contains the entirety of a sect that appears to be basically the police, magical police. And apparently, it's really hard to keep remembering how Sacred Valley worked and know how powerful and sort of ubiquitous the Skysworn seem to be when you're out here, but that when in Sacred Valley, there was no such thing. And I can't help but wonder how this works, what the exact parameters are regarding law enforcement. And I'm putting that in quotes, but for lack of a better term, who decides what the rules are? How do they get decided? What kind of loopholes exist? And because when I say how different things could have been in Sacred Valley were there police, what I mean is really, in Sacred Valley, it was completely down to survival of the fittest, and that seems to be how it works out here as well. It doesn't appear to me that the Skysworn were going to step in when the Jai clan just began to assassinate the Aurelius family. So what exactly are they meant to enforce? We see that one of them has been sent to mediate this duel between Jai Long and Lindon. But other than that, I'm saying magical police because it's a glib way of saying it, but it doesn't feel like that's actually how it works. It doesn't feel like there's a specific parameter and that they are going around and patrolling. Really, it feels like their main issue is has been dealing with black flames. And that, I would suspect, would be what they were like organized to do. And everything else sort of arose from that. And then the black flames sort of disappeared or died out. And it left them with an incomplete mission, maybe. That's like sort of the idea that I have in my head. I don't really have a ton of evidence backing that up. But anyway, so they're on this this floating city. And reminder, they had just escaped the area where the duel had been taking place because it got completely overrun with blood spawn. And they're walking through the city, and Lindon is walking around, and there's a pretty fun little, like, sort of montage of him looking around at all of the strange people. And it's very different because, like, it's not actually, because I was about to say, it's really different than the Desolate Wilds. It's different in that the Desolate Wilds seem to have, like, 3 very specific sects that you could look around and see, oh, that person is with the Sand Vipers because of his gold sign, and this person is a fisher because of their gold sign. And it seemed like it was pretty easy. Not that necessarily everybody fit into one of those sects, but that was a predominant sort of like template in the background. And then everybody who didn't fit into that was sort of overlaid over that. And here, this city is full of people who are all on different paths. And that's the point, is that anybody can apply to be Skysworn. And thus, all of their families can be different. They have taken a path and often are gold by the time they join up. So they have a gold sign that's distinctly theirs, and they don't have to take on something that matches the rest of the people that they're training with or working with now. It's a very different situation than what we have seen before. And I find that to be a kind of a nice, like, progression. It reminds me a little bit. I'm covering The Legend of Korra right now. Mild spoilers again for Korra and Airbender. But Last Airbender, every city was its own type of bending. Earthbenders all lived together. Firebenders all lived together. And when I covered that show with Owen, we would sort of mock that, you know, like, everybody just happens to be an Earth. Like, is that really how this is supposed to? Why? So if you're born an Earthbender somewhere else, do you just have to move to the Earth Kingdom? Like, what is that? And then we started covering Legend of Korra, and the whole point of how that show opens is that there is a new place called Republic City in which benders of all types, as well as non-benders, all live together. And this sort of reminds me of that, where it's like, we have seen different areas where people with different, very specific paths are members of families, and there's like a really particular ritual that they each follow in order to ascend to the next level. And now we're getting to a place where all of that has happened long ago. People have moved beyond the clans that they were born into. And they take this oath and become part of a whole different thing, along with people who are also part of a very different thing. And this is sort of something that had been, like, vaguely on my mind because of the fact that Renfei and, what's his name? Bairo? Yeah. They each seem to have very, very different gold signs. And I didn't mention it at the time, but when I saw that, I was kind of like, oh, okay, so I guess they don't have the same type of path. I had sort of been thinking before that the Skysworn were going to be their own clan that was, and I guess they technically are still called a clan, but it feels different because it's not something that you're born into, and you have to apply. So anyway, all of that just to get that nailed down, that that's the way that this works. So despite they didn't Despite the admiring looks at the Skysworn and the fearful ones at Orthos, they didn't stick out as much as he would have imagined. Paths of all kinds were represented here on the streets of Stormrock. A woman passed over their party without looking down from a book she was reading, a half-dozen tentacles extending from her back and swinging her from building to building. Serious Doc Ock vibes right there. A pack of fiery dogs passed through the middle of the street, following their leader who had a golden crown on his head. They were conversing in quite ordinary human speech about which of them should guard their territory that night. A set of triplets wrapped in identical white ribbons watched the party pass, their eyes in eerie sync. Words floated in midair, as though the characters had drifted up of their own volition. Motherland's Parlor, Goldhammer Soulsmiths, the restaurant in the sky. It took Lindon longer than he cared to admit to realize they were floating business signs, and that realization explained the other signs that were etched in physical material above each building's mantle. Second-ranked soulsmith in the city available for commissions. Ranked number 1 of all mixed bowls in the city, vegetable-only category. Number 4 purveyor of 1,000-mile clouds for civilians, but number 1 in value. I adore this. This is the shit that, and it can come off if you start off a series with this sort of montage. It can feel super, super cheesy. You know, there's a little bit of that for me, even though it's super fun with the Sorcerer's Stone, you know, but that is written in so much more childish a style that you are willing to accept it. This feels like very earned. This has been an extremely serious situation in so many ways. And we haven't really seen a city viewed from this perspective. Anytime that we were around Serpent's Grave, we were in Ethan's head, and he doesn't pay attention to this stuff. He's not seeing things for the first time. So it's not like it registers for him the way that being in Lindon's head when he's visiting for the first time would, because he just gets sent right to fucking training. He doesn't get to like wander around the city, which has been mentioned already by Fisher Gesha, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, let's see. Orthos snorted smoke at one of the guards, but the young man didn't seem to notice. Instead, he asked Spyro if there were any news from the outside. And I really enjoy this. All of these, like, they have all of these healers. They have a routine. And this is something that for me is deeply comforting. I always like knowing that I'm in the hands of people who have dealt with a thing like this before, and they have a method, a series of steps that they carry out whenever they're dealing with something like this. And she tells them about Starsweep Tower. The facilities are exclusive for Skysworn and trainees. Soulsmith's Foundry, she said, state of the art. All our 1,000-mile clouds and our weapons are made and maintained in there. Guys, can we just talk about it for a second? How Lindon finding this 1,000-mile cloud was like a major deal. Like this was a treasure. And now we're somewhere that these are just manufactured as a fucking, like, it's just not a big deal. You know, he basically came from a one-horse town, and now he's in a town with cars. And I, for one, am not used to it yet. I'm still in the mindset of the 1,000-mile cloud being this incredibly priceless, irreplaceable item. And then I keep seeing this, and I have to admit, I'm getting a little salty over it. There's a little bit of me that's like mildly personally offended by the fact that I thought something was really valuable and it turns out it's not. I know how the guys who come on fucking Pawn Stars feel when they think that they've got, like, you know, Thomas Jefferson's signature and it turned out to be like his secretary's, or it turns out to be the signature printed on something and there's like 700 copies of it floating around. And she says, that's our technique library. It's ranked 3rd, Soulsmith tablets being so rare. There are paths that exist only here in the city, thanks to original techniques we managed to salvage in our library. Lindon realized he'd taken a step toward the door. When had that happened? We've also assigned as much space to cycling rooms as we have to bedrooms. Skysworn can't spend all their time focusing on advancement like many sacred artists do. They have combat training, study, and assignments. We have to accelerate the advancement process as much as we can so our cycling regimens are brief but intense. And all of this, of course, Yerin is kind of like, oh, all right, that sounds interesting. Lindon's like, this sounds amazing. Can we do this, please? But there's a huge obstacle, he thinks, which is his rating. They are accepting applications right now. They're recruiting because everything is in total chaos now that there's a fucking dread god on the loose. So Lindon asks what the qualifications are. 20 years of age or younger for low golds, 30 years or younger for high golds. They have to be ranked highly enough. Top 1,000 for high golds, top 3,000 for low golds. Even so, they have to pass our application process. And he asks, what if they aren't ranked? And she says, everyone is ranked, like he's an idiot. And he says that he's not. And Renfei's like, oh, sweetie, no, yeah, you are. Renfei pulled a purple card from a slot over her wrist, touching her fingers to it. Wisps of purple rose from it, and Lindon thought he could see shapes in it. Dream Madra. After your duel with Jai Long, you are ranked 24th among low golds. They must value you highly, though that only takes individual combat power into account, of course. Your skill, aesthetics, and influence are all lower. I am dying to know aesthetics. What does that mean? Does that mean how he looks? Does that mean the flair that he brings to his fighting techniques? The fact that aesthetics is a factor at all just spoke to me so much. You guys, I really appreciate that. So, Lindon's like, 24th? That seems high. And both Byro and Renfei are like, yeah, that's pretty high, and no offense, but I don't really feel like you should be that high. They both clearly think he is being favored unfairly. And I can't really blame them. The fact that other people have to put in the work that they do. And this nobody kid who only just achieved low gold, like, what? A half a year ago? A couple of months ago? This dude is now ranked 24th. Yeah, I could see that being not something that you would feel was fair. So he is over here like about to continue to ask questions about joining up. And this is when Yerin interrupts and asks about Red Moon Hall. And Renfei starts to get really cagey. She starts to be like, well, that's not for us to tell you. That's for the Underlord to tell you. And Lindon has to convince her a little bit that this is something that not only that they should know, because obviously they are trying to help here, but that Ethan would want them to know. He seems to think like saying we are just trying to serve is the way to get her to cave on this, because that's something that he believes she would relate to personally, is wanting to serve. He can sense that's a major like motivating factor to her life. So finally she says it's the cult of a dread god. Usually they operate beyond the Empire's southeastern border. They are people who sought out a fragment of the bleeding phoenix. They call it a blood shadow. They are betting they could control it, but 9 out of 10 can't. Those are just puppets, little better than Bloodspawn themselves. The ones who can control it, they're the ones to watch out for. They're still in the thrall of the Phoenix, but they have their own goals as well. What is it they want? Yerin asked. To feed their master, Byru responded, but before he could say more, a third Skysworn reappeared. And this is where the conversation ends. And when he says to feed their master, I have to assume that's with power. I am sort of assuming that it's like a Madra consumption sort of thing, but I don't know that that's right. It's just sort of like the idea that I have in my head. And we find out a little bit later how what Yerin has got going on inside her is like that sort of fragment. And if anybody could control that, Yerin's the one who could do it. And I am guessing, because I've been saying, you know, obviously Ethan has like a goal for Yerin, and he hasn't wanted her to get rid of the Blood Shadow. When Cassius says, I have no idea what you were thinking of, Ethan's like, no, you don't. I am assuming that's what it is. And we have a whole thing at the end of this where, I can't remember his name. What's the Skysworn Captain, King, Underlord man's name? He is extremely suspicious in a way that Lindon really should be. I kind of thought Lindon was actually as suspicious as this guy, but it seemed like Lindon has figured out that he got used really recently. It doesn't seem like it's really hitting him that this whole thing has been orchestrated the way, if you're looking at this from the outside, it clearly has been. And I sort of realized once it was all laid out, and once this guy was like trying to lead Lindon down the path to come to the conclusion that this is like somebody's sort of setting you up, I didn't really stop to think about the fact that this is an overall goal, because it is just such a foregone conclusion to me. Of course, Ethan has set this whole thing up, because we saw Ethan look at Yerin and Lindon back in the Desolate Wilds, zero in on them, and be like, oh, they'd be perfect. This is a man who is looking for people with specific factors. They had them. And he has been leading them down the primrose path. And they're willing to do what he's asking because it leads to their own personal advancement. But they don't have any idea of the overall goal. All he has said is to the very end, you know, essentially implying that he wants to help them ascend or use them to help him ascend. And I thought Lindon had started to figure that out with the last conversation that he had. But once he has this talk, it seems more and more like maybe he hasn't figured that out. And I'm not really sure what to do with that, because I am worried if he hasn't figured that out yet. What I've sort of, the secondary conclusion I had drawn, if I thought that Lindon had figured out Ethan was using him and had been setting him up, then I can believe if he continues working with Ethan, that means Lindon has forgiven Ethan and is on board in a way with like allowing himself to be used up to a point, because that's what he also needs, is to advance to achieve his own goal. However, now that I realize that Lindon didn't know, this means that potentially down the line, we are going to get a moment where Lindon does figure it out and feels a profound sense of betrayal. And I'm not looking forward to that. And it's not like Ethan wouldn't deserve any sort of judgment that Lindon chose to throw at him for setting him up. It's simply that's the kind of heartbreak and betrayal from Lindon that I think will really hurt. You know, like he has already gone through so much, and it has felt like Yerin's the only person who really had his back. Ethan has been a sort of like godsend in a way. And I worry that if Lindon hasn't figured out Ethan's game here, he's going to start looking at Ethan as a genuine, I don't want to say father figure that feels too intimate, but something like that. And then he's going to realize, and then he's going to be sort of shattered. And I just don't want to see that happen. So when we go inside and have this conversation between Yerin and Lindon, this was really moving to me. Yerin hasn't told anyone the specifics about what happened to her. And when she talks about it with Lindon and explains to him how this like thing showed up, it was attracted to her ability. They have this moment of like intimacy with him putting his arm around her and trying to just make her feel better because he's there. Because he really thinks back to the times that he wished somebody would do that for him. And sometimes somebody would. His parents weren't awful. His sister wasn't awful, but they weren't great. So they weren't always there. And so he's attempting to reach out in the way that he wishes, which is something that comes up again a bit later when he has to choose whether to come or go. And I love when she explains to him about how people would try and take down these parasites and make them part of them. He so confidently just says, well, you didn't do that, because he knows her really well by now. And I like the fact that she smiles at that. She appreciates that he has gotten to know her well enough to immediately discount that she would make a choice like that. And I also love the fact that he has the self-awareness to be like, yeah, she wouldn't do something that stupid. I would do something that's stupid. In fact, that's really interesting. I wonder how, and his mind starts to stray immediately. And I'm just like, oh my God, Lindon, you need to chill. So, she talks about how I was 7 or 8. They called me a genius. Everyone in my town said how shiny my future was going to be. The star of my town made me stick out as it ends up, even to a dread god. So she's coming from this odd other place where, and this is sort of, I'm realizing, a major theme of these books so far is we're dealing with a lot of people who have lost their communities for one reason or another. So we have Lindon, who is born unsouled and is rejected because he can't get a path. We have Jai Long, who screws up with the gold sign that he takes on and winds up being rejected by his family. We have Yerin, who is like so advanced that she draws this unwelcome attention that winds up killing a ton of people. And even to a point, one could say this about Ethan and Cassius, because they are the last remaining survivors of the actual Aurelius bloodline. So they sort of fall outside of things in a weird way as well. And there's this moment, guys, that I will tell you, I completely thought that this author was speaking metaphorically. And I realized that in the moment it's meant to be literal, but I think he's also speaking metaphorically. I just read it as entirely metaphorical at the time. She's describing the attack. If I let it get inside of me, I figured something worse would happen, so I just held it off. Don't know how long I sat there holding it before Master found me. She had started to shake. Her wounds had been wrapped, but not thoroughly bandaged, and some of them had begun to bleed again. But she didn't notice. Okay? That's a word right there. That is a metaphor. Her wounds had been wrapped, but not thoroughly bandaged, and some of them had begun to bleed again. Ooh, when I tell you the hair on my arm stood up, you guys, like, honestly. Ugh. So yeah, he just puts his arm around her, and she says, we're going after them. And he starts to be like, okay, I mean, yeah, but not right now. And he digs his heels in, feeling like they are not ready for this. And Yerin has a very strong reaction here. It's a combination of things happening. One, she wants him to be ride or die, and he isn't quite there yet in this scene. And she has been there for him so much that she sort of took it for granted that he was going to have her back. And when she realizes that he's hesitating, that hurts her. Secondly, they're talking about taking down Bloodspawn and these people who are basically being run by a parasite, which is what killed like her whole family. So this is an incredibly personal vendetta for her as well. So he's not immediately jumping on board, and he is not jumping on board on something that is so particularly a hot button issue for her that him not being on board is even more hurtful, you know? And so she just has a pretty aggressive, like, okay, you know what? I'm doing this and you're going to have to figure it out, because I don't know what to tell you, but I am absolutely, like, there's no question. Lindon is more afraid that he just isn't advanced enough yet. And he hasn't got his arm on either. So that is part of it, is just a fear of just, I'm not ready, which I understand. He just saw one of these dudes take down Ethan very, very nearly, it seems. So I would be also very reticent to do this. So he leaves, and we go to Cassius. And this dude is getting he has like a frog on him made out of blood Madra that's helping to replace the blood that he lost, which is so fascinating to me. And Yerin and Lindon are here with Cassius talking about what to do in terms of like the next steps to take, because Yerin is sort of assuming Cassius is going to be on her side regarding going up against them. And Cassius has an interesting perspective here. Basically, he tells them, because she's assuming, she says, I'll be fighting Red Moon Hall if it's just me and my sword. If you get me to True Gold, you'll be lending me a hand up. And Lindon's like, well, yeah, both of us, actually, because he seems to see this as an opportunity for getting Yerin to slow down. And Cassius has to be like, hey, look, first of all, we have a pretty strict number of parameters for what types of tasks people who are part of our clan have to complete before they are able to get the kinds of resources that you guys have been simply given up until this point. And he says, everything that you guys have been given, Ethan has paid for almost entirely personally. He can generate those scales, which is, he says, if he spent his time doing nothing else, he could generate 3 or 4 top grade scales a day, which is absolutely stunning. Most underlords could not do the same. So additionally, we have the cost of his time when he went to the Desolate Wilds to retrieve you. Every day he spent on you has cost this family a sizable amount of income. And this is something that just never even occurred to me. The idea that Ethan's mere existence can cost money if he's not doing something for the family because of the way that scales function as money. Weird. And that really puts like an extra bit of pressure on everything. And the fact is they are needing to advance quickly while Ethan has been called away to this other meeting. And Cassius is like, I mean, Yerin's already done a fair amount. And she has gotten some of the things that, you know, she's gotten pills, she's gotten sword scales, she's gotten time in our like best cycling room, which I really wonder what makes because he says it's our highest level sword cycling room. I'm assuming because there's a ton of sword Madra in it, or sword aura, and I just wonder what that's like. And she's gotten time with our most experienced sword path instructor, which so happens to be me. And Lindon's like, what? You've been up to all of this? What did you do? What have you gotten? And she lists off like killing some remnants and things like this. And Cassius is essentially like, man, the people who join our family are not really combatants. That's part of why they joined the Aurelius clan, because we're not fighters. We do things to like maintain this place. And Cassius is like, Lindon, this actually is the kind of work that you could do pretty easily. I am saying, go ahead and perform tasks like that and you'll be able to advance. And Yerin's like, yeah, but not fast enough. This isn't going to be enough. And she tries to say that she knows how much sacred arts cost. And he says, yet a minute of your master's time was worth more than a day of Ethan's. Which really puts that into perspective, because he just said how insane Ethan's time is in terms of its sheer worth. I keep not really grasping what a sage means. You know, it's like a whole other fucking thing. I'm happy to provide you with the same support we would to any of our disciples as long as you earn it. And Yerin basically is like, you know what? The Skysworn will let me in as I am. I don't even need to do this. And then they have their kind of like back and forth. She's like, we're not joining another family. We're not abandoning the Aurelius family. The Skysworn can accept us as Aurelius clan and Skysworn. I'm going to go serve the Empire, and I think that they would approve of that. And eventually, she straight up says, I'm going. And she looks at him like waiting for him to say, and he says, I just don't think we should. And he says, I just need a few more days. And she says, don't have them to give. And she walks away, and he stays where he is. And I got really anxious here because I kind of wondered if this wasn't going to be a parting of the ways for them. I didn't think even if it were, that it would be permanent. I expected that were they to part here, they would wind up coming together again eventually later. But the two of them feel like a pair. And I was really happy later when reading Lindon's perspective, how he clearly seems to feel the same way. He's like not entirely... The whole thing feels odd because they've been together through thick and thin through this very important portion of his life. And now they're supposed to separate and he just can't deal with it. And to be honest, I appreciated that he feels the same way that I do. So we go to Yerin and Renfei and Byro. And Yerin is talking to them about the potential for her to join up. And they scan her soul. And she kind of braces herself, expecting that they may be able to see a fragment of this inside of her. And it turns out they read it differently. They believe that what she's got in her is a part of her own power. So they believe that she's on what's called a slaughter path. Sacred artists on paths of blood and the sword weren't the most popular people around. They were known for murdering anybody they came across just to cycle. It had earned them the nickname slaughter paths, though Yerin had heard others. And essentially what they say is that, well, we're going to have to send you through the qualification process. But we find out a little bit later that even if you don't pass the normally like very strenuous qualification process, they are desperate enough now for new recruits because of what's going on that they are finding ways to use people even if they don't pass. So whether she became an official Skysworn or not, she would still wind up fighting this clan, this cult in the end. So then we go to Athen. Officially, Athen was on a private cloud ship on his way to the capital. The cloud ship had actually departed from Stormrock that morning, and he had waved goodbye to it himself. The Emperor had commanded his presence. Naru Huan, patriarch of the Naru clan and sole leader of the Black Flame Empire, was officially on a tour of their southern defenses. He was addressing this crisis personally. In reality, that was almost correct. He was just doing it a bit more directly than the public believed. He waited at the top of the Starsweep Tower at the center of Stormrock. When Athen entered, the Emperor had his back turned and wings spread, looking out vast windows over the city. From here, they could see the edge of the green cloud that supported all of Stormrock, and below them, a dome of hazy red light. Athen was the last to survive. The last to arrive. The other underlords were already there. So, this is interesting to me. I am assuming that this is all so that they aren't together in one place that everybody is aware they are all gathered at, as a security precaution, basically. But this gathering, we meet some new characters. I really enjoy the descriptions, especially when we're coming from Ethan's POV, because he's not so easily cowed by people. And this means that when he gives somebody a bit of a compliment in terms of their abilities, I take it more seriously. There's this woman here who I believe we find out is the sister of the Emperor. And she's like super beautiful, but apparently has a bit of a temper. She's a bit bullheaded and just sort of like plows through things. And I am already interested. I want to know more about her. And I want to know more about Cassius's wife, who I don't remember. They're not the same person, are they? I don't think so, because I don't think it's mentioned that she's got like her eyes haven't been replaced. But Cassius's wife just sounds so badass, and I just really want to know more about her. So here we have everybody coming up to the details of the situation, finding out about how Jai Daisho is the one who instigated this whole thing because he went and raided and took some really valuable weapons, and he awakened this whole thing. And Ethan asks if the Skysworn will be enough to stop Red Moon Hall. Naru Gui gave him a look. We will serve the Empire with honor, and we are recruiting as we speak. But we could use as many applicants as we can, if only to keep the peace while we focus on the real battle. And then we have this old sea captain who comes up, and he says, we've got 3 problems. The blood spawn. They're part of the Phoenix's power, so they'll only show up in the red zone, but they'll spread further as it keeps waking up. Guys, when he said, as it keeps waking up, I nearly died. I assumed this shit was a result of it woken and coming at them. These blood spawn are rising and going out into the world because this thing sort of stirred in its sleep a little bit. That's all it took. And this is just so much worse than I thought. Oh, God. They will spread further as the Dread God wakes until every drop of blood inside 100 miles will hatch into a monster. I'd call that a regional emergency on its own. Second, Red Moon Hall. They've got vassals, which let the Blood Shadows take control. They can be managed. But then we've got the emissaries. Powerful sacred artists even before they controlled their parasites. With a Blood Shadow, they can each fight beyond their stage. Battle reports we've received from the Akura clan confirm multiple emissaries at the Underlord level, as well as at least one Overlord and supposedly the Sage of the Red Faith. And at this point, everybody had been murmuring and alarmed. Once he gets to the end of that sentence, everybody's dead-ass silent. And then, lastly, we have the actual Dread God. So what it's coming down to here is that shit is going so far left that they genuinely don't really have any contingency plan for dealing with something on this scale. And what I feel like here, everybody get ready for me to climb up on my soapbox real quick because I'm going to do it. This feels to me like a bit of what has happened with the pandemic, where this is just something that we weren't ready for. We had nothing built into our system to accommodate this sort of emergency. And what we should do in response is give everybody access to resources. We should be paying everybody to stay home. We should be making it as easy and accessible as possible for people to social distance and avoid commutes and being in offices. But we don't want to do that because we just don't have a way to cope if we do that. So instead, we try to act like everything is fine and do our best to have a half-assed partial version of a real quarantine. what I feel about this situation is sort of similar. What they should do is everybody has all of these like expensive resources, pills and elixirs and all of these things that they could give to those on lower levels to help boost them quickly and get more fighters, people who are further along on their paths, to help. But they are restricted to those who can afford them, which means that you're just shooting yourself in the foot. And it's just so frustrating to know. And granted, it's not as easy as just take this pill and then you level up. Like we see with Lindon, how he has to really put himself through it with getting his iron body in order to be able to sustain what's going to happen to him when he gets to later stages. But we could compensate for that. Like that could be taken into account. I just don't see that being really on the table. They whether or not it's about time, which I argue it, I don't know how long it takes for the Dread God to fully awaken. So I can't really speak to that, how long we've got before the real shit begins to pop off. But I feel like it wouldn't do any harm to just give it a shot and see how many people you can level up wildly and equip with crazy weapons and see how that goes. Anyway, so Ethan goes forward and is about to speak. He does this exaggerated, like, oh, my shoulder hurts after his injury, but the woman who healed him, like, knows perfectly well that he's fine. And he explains to them about how the guy he went up against was a real badass. And he's like, I could say that if it was just one like him, we would probably be just fine. But that's not what we're dealing with. He has allies. And he says, though I could not measure their strength accurately, the fact that I could sense them at all from so far away suggested they had at least as much raw power as I. That wasn't necessarily true, but it could be, and it suited Ethan's purposes. With so many underlords in the enemy's forces, it seems right to me that we should count ourselves as the front line of defense. I know it will be difficult to set aside our own agendas, so in the interest of unity, I propose we should assist the Skysworn directly. And I love this because he knows that everybody's going to be kind of like, really? But also, he has seen that Yerin's planning to enroll, and he really wants to be like directly involved in that, so he has his own vested interest in this as well. And then we get Narusea, I think is how you say her name, the Emperor's little sister. And she says, come on, man. We all know what to do. We have the underlords, the overlord. We need to find the sage, and then we take the fight to them. We might be able to just take them all completely down. And then we evacuate. People do it all the time. We will just do that. And mentally, Ethan is like, that's not bad, actually. It probably would work. But the problem is that they are going to be like abandoning so much that perhaps they will never get back. He says, if they simply weathered this storm without destroying Red Moon Hall, they would be inviting another apocalyptic crisis in the future. It was never good to leave enemies behind you. Of course, they didn't know the enemy's full strength, and they didn't have the power to deal with the forces they knew about. And I'm just like, what does that mean? This dude. Ugh. I'm running out of time. I'm really going to have to speed this up. So, at this point, the Emperor tells Ethan that he is going to have to be the one to go represent them to the Akura family. And we don't know anything about this yet. They have shielded us from the dragons for generations, and they might grant us grace this time as well. You're sending me to die, he said. We do not waste resources in time of war, but if your death will grant us the chance at an audience with a monarch, then yes, your blood is cheap to us. And Ethan's looking at him, and then for a moment, he's just like, what the fuck? And then a second later, he realizes, oh, that's a good idea. And immediately, gets on board. And honestly, I can be that way myself. And I really respected the fact that he did. If somebody proposes something that is coming way out of left field, it can often look like I'm being belligerent when I question it. But a lot of times it's me thinking super hard and being like, what do you mean? Why are you suggesting that? I really want to know everything about the details as to why you're saying this. And I don't realize how sort of like, you know, aggressive I seem. And then once I like absorb that, I'll stop and be like, no, yeah, okay, good. Let's do that. And it's just like, I was finding very, very relatable. And he says, we also must reveal the Akura family have recently asked a service of us. As we have agreed to their terms, currently we are in better footing with their clan than we have ever been before. Athan does not know about this. It says that he had been unaware there was anything more than an incidental contract. And I'm like, well, Athan didn't know. So what's going on here? The Akura protected the Empire from dragons simply because they were both humans, but otherwise they were utterly apathetic. Only their lack of motivation kept them from enslaving the entire populace or raising them for cultivation resources. What favor could the Emperor possibly do for a monarch's family? Athan was dying to find out. Get it? All right, so I'm going to speed through this a little bit because, again, I'm running out of time. But we go to Fisher Gesha getting Lindon's arm ready for him, and she's kind of nervous about this. They're dealing with some stuff that she hasn't really worked with too much, and she doesn't know how this is going to go. And I love that Lindon like uses his perception to sort of reach out for this arm, and he begins to realize that there is a hunger to it that he needs to also exhibit in a way in order for it to feel unity with him. And I'm going to read this small part. As the binding approached, the arm squirmed toward it, fighting against the hold of his spirit. He tried to ask her to wait, but the word came out as a croak. Then the binding slid into the arm, and he had to absorb it. It had gone wild, twisting and writhing. He could almost hear a snarling in his head as it sought to devour something. And then the hand goes for the Sylvan River Seed, and he has to, like, block it and stop it. And Gesha tells him that the arm is out of control, and this is the only thing of this material that we've got, and we could potentially destroy it if this doesn't work out. There had to be something he could do to salvage this. It would be a waste of irreplaceable materials and far too much time. So he studies the arm and he feels that like hunger. And without context, the arm was out of control. It needed a mind to control it, a will to keep it in check. And it fit him. There was a little of this hunger in him already. He focused on that, stoking his desire for power, the feelings of envy and awe he'd felt when Suriel had demonstrated absolute authority, the aching helplessness of living as unsouled, and his desire to get stronger, as strong as he could. The arm stiffened like a dog catching a new scent. Lindon threw more at it, his feelings as he looked over the Heaven's Glory School's treasures. He wanted it all, but even that wouldn't be enough. He remembered the sensation of black flame, the desire of a dragon to conquer and destroy. Then he shoved the end of the arm onto his stump. And he winds up blacking out. And when he wakes up, Fisher Gesha is holding her hand over his elbow. And she's like, man, you can't just go doing shit like that. Dude, like... And she says, and you made me forge it on, so that will hurt your compatibility. And I wonder if that's going to come back and bite him at any point. An impulsive soulsmith is a dead soulsmith. I can say that much for certain. And he's like, look, I'm sorry, but I just had an instinct that it works. And she simultaneously acknowledges that instinct is super important, but also don't be a fucking moron. And at this point, she's telling him that he needs to rest and give time to get used to this arm and be able to get used to his Madra channels. She's like, I am not kidding. Please don't take this as like a friendly recommendation for optimal performance. I am saying you could die. You could fuck yourself up really bad. Do not try to use the binding yet, please. And she says 4 to 6 weeks. So he is looking over his new arm, really like excited about it. And he says, gratitude, I'm excited to see what I can do with this. And she looks at him for a minute. And then she says, what is wrong with you? And I loved this so much. Basically, she's like, dude, if you keep going at the pace you are going to burn out. It's not even about just like your body. It's just sheer everything. You need rest. You're a person. All people need it. I don't know if you think you're special and don't need it, but that's not how this works. No matter how many other parts you add, no matter how much you ascend, you still need it. And he says, if I don't try as hard as I can't catch up. And she's like, to who? And he doesn't want to admit that he's thinking of Yerin and Ethan. And she's like, dude, you're ranked higher than 75% of the people in the entire empire. And you're living every day like you're trying to die. What the fuck? And Lindon has to admit to himself that it's not just, oh, she has a point. He already knew this. He's feeling scraped raw is the word. And he felt like a man who had started to run down a hill, going faster and faster until he couldn't stop. Now he had to keep accelerating or stumble and fall. The problem was he really couldn't stop. As enticing as that vision was, he could never return to his homeland as an underlord, not if it took him more than 30 or more years. His home would be gone by then. So this moment, he gets very emotional, and they don't get to finish this conversation because they get interrupted by Yerin. But I was so glad somebody said this to him, and it occurred to me too the other day, like, this came to mind, like, I keep wanting to call Lindon Yerin. Lindon's attitude about advancing and how much he is willing to put himself through in order to advance sort of occurred to me the other day while I was at the gym. And I was like doing some squats, and I was having to really push through the last couple reps on one set. And I was like, Lindon would do it. I literally thought that to myself, like, let's be like Lindon and just fucking push it. And then a second later, I was like, yeah, but Lindon can immediately heal once he ascends to his iron body and once he gets to his jade body. He just is able to immediately recover from damage that he did himself. That's not how people work. And that sort of got me thinking about the fact that I don't want him to constantly be able to shirk rest, and that would feel like a bit of a shortcut. And I'm glad that this is getting addressed, because I feel like this is something he's going to have to cope with. The fact that it's been spoken aloud means he will have to deal with it at some point. So Yerin comes in, and this is when they say goodbye to each other. And it's a really emotional moment. He sits down and just cries after she leaves. And he doesn't know what to do. He's like so lost. And he goes to Orthos's room and is talking to him about how Yerin went off without him. And the turtle's like, well, why? And he says they're fighting against Red Moon Hall. And Lindon feels the reaction in Orthos's body when he mentions Red Moon Hall. He had heard about the blood spawn, what they'd done while he slept, and that they'd come from a dread god. In his mind, Red Moon Hall had made a fool of him while he slept. And Orthos is like, oh, so she's going by herself, and you're just gonna not go and let them come here and destroy everything with their blood spawn? Is that how this is gonna work? And Lindon says, if I went, I wouldn't even offer anything. I'd be going to lose or to die. And Orthos is like, that just sounds like sheer fear. What do you actually want to do? You make decisions for yourself. And Lindon realizes he wants to go. And he heads out the door. Now, I already talked about that I have read chapter 13, but I'm at the end of my time. And I haven't actually talked much about what happens in 13. And I'm deciding whether or not I want to save it and talk about it next time, or if I want to just do a quick, because like there is a combination of things. We've just got Lindon following after Yerin and telling her that he is coming with her. And she is very obviously deeply moved that he's coming, but she can't really like tell him that. There's also the fact that evidently he was supposed to be like being kept in that tower, which I didn't even realize it was supposed to be that he was being imprisoned, essentially. She says, "How did you really get past the guards?" And he says, "Well, Orthos burned a hole in the wall." And I just wasn't aware that he was being kept like under guard in that way. So that took me a little bit by surprise. It makes sense because he is a black flame, and as we see later, that winds up being kind of an issue. I think I'll wait and talk about that next week, because the way that the page numbers shake out, there's 280 pages total, 285, and it was going to be kind of an uneven ending. So I think next week I will cover 13, 14, 15, and that will get us to 224. And that way 16, 17, and 18 will make it to the end of the book. So that's how I'll break down the rest of it. But yeah, I'm really like, I can't believe how fast this book goes. All of these books go by pretty quick, and the pacing is so fast also that it even makes it seem shorter. But I just can't believe that we're almost at the end of book 4 now at this point. Good God. All right. Well, thank you again so much to Andy for your flexibility and for commissioning this. I hope you guys are enjoying it, and I will be seeing you again soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.